Hey,
Hi.
Andre. How
Hey,
are you?
Dwane. I'm good. How are you?
Great.
Thank you for being here and interviewing me.
Absolutely. My pleasure.
So, Dwane, clearly I'm releasing an anthology of poems and short stories called Variations of Time and Nature, and Dwane is very gracious to sit with me for a little bit so we can chat about it. Dwane and I have been friends for a very long time,
Mhm.
and he was one of the people who gave me amazing feedback in the novel Ripped in Two and also on this anthology um, that is directly linked to the novel as well, Ripped in Two. So thank you for also doing this. How many favors can I ask?
No, it's my pleasure. This is really exciting. I'm fun. I'm excited to be part of it.
Yes. Um, so I guess let's get right to it, right? Because
Sure.
we just have like a few minutes for it.
So, why don't you tell us what Variations on Time and Nature is about?
So yeah, I had when I was writing the novel Ripped in Two, a main character of it called Elijah is a writer in the novel, and I had this idea as I was creating that universe that that novel is set in, that whenever I wrote a character who was an artist in any shape or form, that I would also eventually release whatever works that they've produced, like whether they were writers or painters, photographers and so on, that I would try to just kind of dive further into their artistic sensibility through them. So actually, Variations of Time and Nature is something that Elijah writes in the novel Written to, and and is released like in the storyline of that novel. He releases it in, and so I wanted to, give the readers of that novel the ability to kind of like dig into more of his psyche as an artist and see his opinions of the world and what he feels about his relationships in his life and so on. And so, yeah, I had a great time just kind of going further into his mind. But at the same time, I wanted it to do it in a way where if you haven't read the novel yet, that you can just enjoy his work,
Absolutely.
because of course in the world of the novel, there is no novel, right? It's like he's just living his life in that story he releases this anthology. So I wanted it to do it in a way where even if you didn't read it, you could still enjoy the poems and short stories.
Yeah. Yeah, it's great. I think it reads really well, and it could be just another collection of short stories written by an amazing author, and so I think it works really well. But it's also fun and exciting that there is this tie-in between this character and the other novel that is people who have read Ripped Into can kind of appreciate more. You get a little bit more of a backstory and an appreciation and love for this character that we've already gotten to know, which is it's really cool.
Yeah, and then what I'm hoping as well too is that, if you haven't read Ripped Into, that reading Variations of Time and Nature, it's clearly an easier read because it is poems and short stories, and that it will spark your interest to read the novel after. Because whatever order you read it in, it kind of doesn't matter. Like you'll still be able to get something from from either way of doing it. So yeah, and I kind of like I'm excited. It comes out October 14th, and I can't wait to drop it.
Yes. So, how did you develop the style of writing for Elijah as the character?
So yeah, so every poet and every writer, every artist is different, and you have to find their voice, right? So I have an extensive acting background, which has helped me with writing, vice versa, and so I had written a first draft of this anthology a very long time ago, and it wasn't linked to Ripped in Two, to the novel. And then as I finished, I believe it was after the first draft of Ripped in Two, I had like a dream that I needed to figure out. I was thinking about it. I was like, I need to figure out what Elijah's sensibility as a writer is, because I may have to add it into the novel, like some of his poems or a bit of his short story. But I hadn't written those yet. And I said, okay, I need to write them. And so I had this dream, like a literal dream, where someone was telling me that I should pull out this anthology that I had written, Variations of Time and Nature. It's not published. I did it for a course that I took in college. And so, and it says, just have, pretend you're Elijah and sit down and look at the poems and critique them as if you were like, you know, just kind of, and see what his thoughts are. And then, of course, when Elijah sat down and critiqued it, he didn't like most of the poems that I had written. And, you know, and it actually makes a lot of sense because he and I, if he was a real person, I mean, I know his psyche and everything, are very different, even though there's some similar things that I would say, I mean, he's coming out of me kind of. So we're still like, I don't even know if we would be friends in real life. I just kind of, you know, so he's very different. So it's clear to me that he would have thoughts, but because he had thoughts and opinions, then it like informed me what his writing sensibility would be. So then I made it go, okay, well, if you don't like this poem, how would you make it better? And so I started to go from there. And then from there, he started rewriting some of the poems. And then from rewriting some of those poems, he started writing new ones. And then I just kept going. I kept going. And then a couple of the poems actually at that point then made it into the novel. And then I had this idea to write short stories to it because he mentions 4 short stories in Written 2 that he's working on. And so I thought, well, let me write those. And so, and then one of them, actually, I think after I wrote the 3rd draft, there were 4 drafts of that novel. So after I wrote the 3rd draft, well, on the 3rd draft, I decided to add in pieces of one of the short stories just to kind of give an example of how he works. And it actually ends up being one of my favorite chapters in the novel. I think it's chapter 12. Mm-hmm. And so, yeah, so that's how kind of I figured it out, I guess. You know, I think if you're trying to figure out, it's an advice that I would give if you're writing about an artist. I think first you have to figure out their psyche, and then after that you have to figure out what they like and what they don't like in art. So right now for the future, I am writing something, and one of the characters in it is a painter. Well, I'm not a painter, but I have met painters in my life, and so one of the things I have done in the past for it is to go to museums and stand there knowing the psyche of that character and like critiquing the paintings that I'm seeing. And I don't have to be an expert. I just have to understand what he likes and what he doesn't like about it so that that can inform how he would paint. And so I think it's one way I figure out to get to know like the specificity of those writers or of those artists. Yeah.
Yeah, no, that's awesome. And I think you do that very well. I think it's definitely an asset to your writing that I think it works well. So how do you, going back into Variations of Time and Nature, how did you decide to break up each individual poem and chapter, or into chapters, I guess?
Yeah, you know, and so the anthology is divided into 4 sections, and it's Winds of the Past, Waters of Today, Fires of Tomorrow, and Earth Ever Changing. So I wanted to add to each section an element of time and nature, but I didn't. At first, I was kind of trying to figure out how I would do that. How I could organize the poems. And even though it seems very obvious now because of time and nature that I would split it into sections like that, it wasn't obvious to me when I was putting it together. In the novel Written 2, Elijah releases this anthology in the year 2017. So, but the people who release it, it's released for him, the people who release it for him are two other characters, are his mother and his wife. And so they get together and release it for him. And there are reasons in the novel for that happening that way. So they are the ones that decided how to organize the poems and how to put it together. And so I was trying to figure it out as Andre, and then I said, wait, but those two characters are the ones that gather all the poems together and the stories and figure it out. So then, I did the same thing acting wise. I pretended to be those two characters and wrote down reasons why I felt it should go one way or another. And then eventually I looked at what I had written for both of those characters because I clearly couldn't be both at the same time, like in my, so I had to do one and then the other. And then I saw where they could agree. And then eventually, they both said, oh, it should be, add earth, wind, fire, water to it, and then like past, present, future. And then I couldn't figure out what the last one would be. And then it made sense that it would be ever changing. So it keeps like moving. But it was actually his wife, which is Dana, in the novel that said it should really flow where it goes 10 poems and a short story in each section. And all the poems should be like halfway through, they should switch the tone. Halfway through one section, it should switch the tone, but then they should all push toward moving into what the theme of the story that is at the end of each section. So in Fires of Tomorrow, for example, the poems are all set in future tense. They're all like, watch out for the future is coming, or whatever. And they're all very fervent, but there's definitely a switch halfway through that section. And then by the time it gets to the short story, the very last poem is called like, there's global warming is one of the poems, and then Burn the Witch, which is like, it couldn't get more like intense. And then it jumps into the short story, which is the heaviest, most fiery story in the collection. So that's how they kind of informed those two characters it should be. And so again, I had to just go back to the psyche of those two women and how they felt about, her son and her husband's writing, and see how, and then I went from there. Yeah.
Well, that's awesome. So that's to get more into, you've mentioned some of the poems and the short stories now. What were some of the other themes in some of your more favorite pieces?
So as far as the poems, I mean, I of course, it's hard for me to pick which one are my favorites. I mean, they're all, I feel like at this point, like the anthology couldn't function if I took one of them out. Like it would feel like it's missing something. But I did choose 4 of them to release as teasers, looking at self-portrait, message spread, global warming, and from where it came and to where it went. And I decided to release those because those 4 poems felt more current to me in the sense of what's happening now in our lives. But here's the thing. The anthology is released in 2017. So I couldn't, especially in the poem Global Warming that talks about basically everything that's happening, everything that we know has been publicized that it's happening concerning global warming and climate change. I try to shove it into that poem. And so, but I had to speak it in the sense of, 3 years ago.
Yeah.
So I couldn't necessarily be like, oh, there's a pandemic. I couldn't say that because there wasn't coronavirus yet. So, but how do I relate it to now, and so on and so forth. So, I just I really dug back into, exercises that Elijah would have been told to do, or things that he would, at the time that he wrote these 4 poems. In the novel, it's at the time where he was living in New York City. That character lives in New York for 2 years, and so and goes to Columbia University. So I wanted to for him to talk, like living in New York myself. I know that New York is a city where like everything's in your face and people talk about things constantly, and so yeah, so I wanted to bring those four poems into what's happening now. I think my favorite poem in the entire thing is From Where It Came and to Where It Went. It's a poem
Mm.
that talks about kind of globalization, but just kind of reminds you that like, oh, that shirt you're wearing, you know, the cotton came from this country, it was put together in this other country, and then it's sold in this other country. Or even that sushi roll that you're eating, the rice came from somewhere, the fish came from somewhere, the fish eggs came from another place, the soy sauce comes from another place, and then it's sold over here. So it's like, it was a way that through Elijah, if he was living in New York, he would have noticed these things and kind of would have talked about in, you know, his group of friends and so on and so forth. And it would be something that would be in his mind at the time. Um, so yeah, so I wanted to bring these four poems as highlights into the novel. And they're actually, each of those four, they're from a different section. So From Where I Came and to Where I Went, it's from Earth Ever Changing, the last section, which kind of shows you how things change. Like here's one thing and it gets turned into this and it becomes this and so on and so forth.
Oh, fantastic.
Yeah.
And then what about the short story? So you put them at the end of each section. Um, did you have did you write them specifically to wrap up the poems, or did you already have these short stories in mind and you found how they fit
Yeah, I kind of actually originally I didn't have those short stories be part of the anthology, but then I think when I was writing the final draft of Ripped in Two, and I decided to add one of the stories to the novel, sample parts of that story, then I changed my mind. I was like, oh, these short stories should be part of this, and he talks about them anyway in the novel, so I should do it. Um, I just felt that as to me, it had that sensibility of like a river going into the ocean, right? So I actually, the very first short story that I thought, oh my gosh, this makes sense being in here, is the short story called The Lake, which comes in the waters of today. Just that short story is set in a lake. The main character of that story is talking about Buckley Dunton Lake, which is a major geographical point in the plot of Written 2, but this other character is in here now too. And so it just made sense suddenly that it would be there. In fact, I was reading Waters of Today, that section at one point, trying to decide what poems should go in there. And then I can't even remember why exactly. I just decided to pick up The Lake and read it. And then I went, oh, somehow that like goes together. And then I started to notice, I wonder if the other three stories that I wrote, if they would fit. And then it was clear to me that one was a fiery story. The other was kind of like set in the past, which then became Winds of the Past. And then the other one talked about a character changing. And so I think that's what happened. And, you know, Glimpses of the Forest deals with like the betrayal of a lover, and it's very tragic. And so, but then it also talks about it being in such a distant past, and people remembering the tale. And so, it just felt to me that it was something that would feel like very much far away. And then the lake is set in the present, and it's a story about figuring out how your soulmate can actually be the work that you do, and then your physical soulmate can actually be um, second in your life, and that's okay if both are on the same page, you know. So that felt like a topic to me that's very like current, um, that I have had to deal with, that I know friends of mine have had to deal with who work a lot to try to get the things that they, you know, to make their passion manifest. And then the third story, Visions from a Smoking Flame, um, is is about a psychic who's having visions of the future, and how she goes, how she's unable to kind of see the signs. The universe is trying to tell her that there's danger coming for her, and she keeps not really paying attention to it and dismissing it. And so it felt to me like a story about the future and ignoring the future, which I think is the same theme of global warming and of that poem and many other poems in the Fires of Tomorrow section. So, and then the last story, Cambio, it's about a woman who has a visit from a ghost, and the ghost is informing her about behavior that she did in a past life that's affecting her in the current life. And so, and how she can change that. So it felt to me, Earth ever changing, but it's also in the spiritual like world, and friends that I have were very spiritual. They, behavior in past life and so on and so forth is a topic that's often talked about. And so I don't see many short stories that I have encountered that deal with that. And so I kind of wanted to write something that would wrap up the novel, the anthology, because of its title, Variations of Time and Nature. I wanted to kind of go like, and then, it changes and then it wraps up. And so in the name of that short story, Cambio is actually chain in Spanish. And so just made sense to put those topics in the end. So yes, I had a feeling that they each would wrap up the section. So it goes boom like this, and then you can move forward to the next thing.
That's awesome. Yeah, I think it's great. I'm really excited. I loved reading it. I can't wait to see it when it's released. When did you say it was coming out again?
So it comes out October 14th. Hopefully I can get it out like a day early just because, but it's on Amazon, and it's gonna be available in paperback and ebook. And it's on paperback in 7 different countries, and then on ebook I think it's 12. So
awesome.
we're able to have a little bit of a wider market on the ebook, but I actually I love having books in my hand. So I'm old school. I'm still buying physical copies of things, even though I have a Kindle. So, I'm a sucker for those. But here is the cover. Clearly, that is the cover, and I had a great time. I worked with an artist called Alora Kate, and she designed the cover for Written 2 and this cover as well. So basically the way she and I work together is that I literally tell her specifically what I want in it. And then I do a horrible sketch, like drawing. I literally can't even draw like a tree. It's so horrible. But I usually send her a sketch and she goes, what is this? I go, that's a tree. and so we have a couple of meetings, we discuss things, and then we go back and forth. She shows me something, and then I give her feedback, and so on and so forth. But I added all the elements of, clearly there's a clock right there, lightning, and then there's water, the tree in the forest, and then some fire right there.
Yeah.
And there's a windmill right there above the E. In my name, there it is. And I think this way it just adds all the elements of nature. So I'm really excited. I love this cover, and I love this work. And then I'm excited to have it be out there, and then move on to the next thing.
Yes, which I'm also excited for. I can't wait.
I know the next thing is a play. This is a stage play that is linked to this world as well. That you actually, there was a reading that I did of this play years ago in New York, and you were there, and you gave me feedback.
Binary Stars, yeah?
Yeah, and now it's gonna, I've changed it. I'm still changing, still working on it, but I'm changing it a lot. And, it has, Elijah is in that play now, alongside his wife Dana, and so it just has changed a lot. And I'm excited to get to that point as well. But for now, Variations of Time is coming out, and I'm excited to share it. Get it?
I'm reserving my copy now.
Thank you so much for doing this, Dwane. I appreciate it.
Thank you.
And yeah, I can't wait until we chat next time.
Yay.
Thank you, everybody.
Bye.
Bye.